resume.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Brock Martland, M-A-R-T-L-A-N-D, and I'm appearing along with Laura Tessaro, T-E-S-S-A-R-O, and Micah Carmody, C-A-R-M-O-D-Y, and the first name is M-I-C-A-H. But this is with respect to the hearings that begin today on habitat management. I'll perhaps take a few moments at the outset to offer you some comments about the hearings that are coming, and then we'll begin with our panel today. We are leading evidence in these hearings, Mr. Commissioner, really at an overview level with respect to habitat management by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We will be following, we have 2 days with this panel, 1 day with a second with a witness who's testifying alone on Wednesday, Dave Carter. And then on Thursday, Friday, and concluding on Monday, we turn to habitat enforcement. These are not hearings that focus on particular habitat impacts. As I say, they're general and they're at an overview level. And I say that simply to alert participants of the fact that there may well be questions that arise in the context of a particular habitat issue, for example, gravel extraction or aquaculture, which do tie to the management or overview part of this, and I think that appropriate. On the other hand, once we veer more and more into detail on particular habitat topics, and especially those for which we have dedicated hearing time planned ahead, I may be looking to object or at least try to curtail us departing from the management overview approach, if you will. I should also say that I'm heartened by the response from Participants' Council with respect to their estimates and approach from the estimates I've received. This is a panel where, without trying very hard, I could spend 3 days covering points in direct. No doubt participants could spend a great many hours or days with their questions as well. And the simple fact is we need to conclude this evidence in the 2 days that we have. As a result of that imperative, I've cut down my questions and certainly the number of documents that I'll be referring to. I'll be asking participants to follow the same course. Again, I'll make myself somewhat of a pest in reminding people of the remaining time for their questions. As I say, though, from the estimates that have been provided, Mr. Taylor, for example, for Canada indicating in the range of an hour, I think we're in good shape, and I'm optimistic that if my questions and Mr. Taylor's and perhaps those of one other or two other participants conclude today, we should be in good shape to conclude this. As a procedural matter at the outset, I'd like to have the policy and practice report that has been prepared in relation to these hearings, and it's before you on the screen. It's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Habitat Management Policies and Practices dated March 8, 2011. I'd ask that please be filed as a PPR in these proceedings.
It'll be marked as PPR number 8.
In terms of the exhibit list that's been provided to participants, I'll be making reference to that exhibit list and the numbers on it as I go to particular documents. As I say, I don't intend to mark even half of those documents as exhibits. Mr. Commissioner, that said, I'm in a position to begin with the evidence of the first panel comprised of Patrice LeBlanc, Rebecca Reed, and Jason Wong. If they could be affirmed, please, Mr. Registrar.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
I do.
You state your name, please.
Jason Huang.
Rebecca Reed.
Patrice Leblanc.
Thank you. Council.
Thank you. I will begin simply with biographies, and Mr. Bissett, if you could please bring up number 2 on the exhibit list. Mr. LeBlanc, I'll ask this of you. I hope you'll recognize your CV on the screen there. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'd ask that be marked as an exhibit, please.
Exhibit 645.
And I will ask a remarkably awkward and long question, but I think it's an efficient way for me to try and cover your background. I'd ask you to please alert me if I've got anything wrong. I should indicate these are descriptions that are from the witness summaries. The witness summaries, Mr. Commissioner, are not being filed in the hearings, but they've been provided to participants. In a brief way, Mr. LeBlanc, you have degrees from Université de Moncton, University of Toronto, and additional graduate work in environmental and resource studies from Dalhousie University. Is that correct?
Correct.
You joined DFO in 1982 as Chief Habitat and Resource Development Research Division after previously having worked in academia and spending 14 years in senior positions in environmental management, both with consulting firms and provincial electricity utilities.
Correct.
In 1988, you left the department and joined the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, and in 1995, you took a 2-year assignment to head the newly established Environmental Management Authority of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm sure that last position is one we're all jealous of on a dark day like this. And you returned to the Department of Fisheries in 1998 as Director, Habitat Operations Branch, is that correct?
That's correct.
In the last 14 years, I understand you've served as a National Director of the DFO's Habitat Management branches, apart from a 6-month assignment, again, or at least in that case, acting as a special advisor to the government of the Bahamas.
Correct.
And you currently serve as the Director of the Habitat Management Policy Branch in the Program Policy Sector based in the National Capital Region.
Correct.
Thank you. If I could ask Mr. Bissett for number 3 on the list to be brought up. Ms. Reid, I think you'll recognize your CV when it appears there, is that correct?
That's right.
And I'd ask that be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 646.
Ms. Reid, you have degrees from the University of Saskatchewan and from UBC, and began your career with DFO in 1990 as a shellfish quality specialist. And from 1996 to 2000, you worked on Aboriginal fisheries issues, and after that served as Area Director, Central Coast Area, as Regional Director, Policy and Economic Analysis, and as Regional Director, Treaty and Aboriginal Policy. Is that correct?
That's right.
In 2007, you became the Regional Director in OHEB, the Oceans Habitat and Enhancement Branch, assuming responsibility for the Habitat Management Program. Is that correct?
Yeah, I just noticed a mistake on my resume where I've got that noted as my substantive position. That's not correct.
Okay. And sorry, the mistake on the resume refers to the substantive, the last entry under experience?
Where it says Regional Director OHEB. And
Okay.
It says substantive position. That's an error.
Thank you for that correction. In 2007, you became the Regional Director, I'm sorry, I just asked you that. From June 2010 to January 2011, you served as the Acting Associate Regional Director General. Is that correct?
That's right.
And then your current position is Regional Director, Fisheries Management.
That's right, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Wong, I'll ask Mr. Bissett to bring up number 4 on the list. Sir, that's your CV, and if I could ask you to push the button on the mic so the trick is the red light there, and I'll remind you as if I'm moving. That's your CV?
Yes.
Thank you. I'd ask that be marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 647.
Mr. Wong, you attained a biology BSc from Simon Fraser University in 1994 and previously had a BCIT technical diploma in fisheries, wildlife, and recreation. Is that correct?
Yes.
You serve as the area manager OHEB for the BC Interior area, and in that capacity you oversee both the Habitat Program and the Salmon Enhancement Program for the BCI, the BC Interior area.
Yes.
You've been in that position since 2006, and previously from the years 99 to 2006 held a similar position as Area Chief for the BC Interior North, and that was before, as I understand it, the North and South areas were united under one area manager.
That's right.
Before that, you spent 5 years with the department as a habitat biologist based in Prince George,
Yes.
and you're currently based in Kamloops.
Right.
I'll do this without asking for an explanation of the policy. Mr. LeBlanc, I'll be directing these questions, I expect, your way. We have in the policy and practice report, and indeed an exhibit already in these proceedings, is the habitat policy itself. I won't be turning to those for these questions. Rather, if I might request, though, that you describe to us the central, what I've understood to be a central feature of the habitat policy, the no net loss of productive capacity principle, and if you could please explain that in particular, we'd appreciate it.
Okay, let me situate the no net loss in terms of the Habitat Policy of 1986, providing a comprehensive framework for the administration of provisions of the Fisheries Act to manage impacts of human activities on fish and fish habitat. The net gain objective is a broad policy objective, and conservation, restoration, and development goals underpin that net gain policy objective. The no net loss is situated as one of the guiding principles, or is the main guiding principle in the policy to support the conservation goal, and it is a guiding principle which allows for offsetting losses to fish and fish habitat when there is no ability to mitigate or reduce the impact to a minimum. So it is intended to offset losses. There is a procedure in the policy document that allows for guiding people on how to, or staff, on how to apply the no net loss principle.
In terms of the use of an area or an area footprint as a surrogate for calculating the impact on productive capacity, could you explain how that is used and what other approach could be used hypothetically or realistically?
There are a number of scientific models that can be used to help assess no net loss or the productive capacity, I should say, of fish habitat. However, these are fairly complicated and usually fairly difficult to apply by practitioners in the field. What we use is the sort of as a surrogate is a footprint. So if you have, just for an example, of 10 units of spawning habitat being harmfully altered or disrupted or destroyed, mostly destroyed, you would then offset that 10 units of habitat somewhere, or an equivalent of that habitat somewhere else near to the project.
And could you comment on how that, whether that sort of a use of an area footprint model works or doesn't work in a situation where you're not dealing with an impact that is area specific? And the example that springs to mind is a degraded water quality situation.
While the no net loss applies to both the deposit of deleterious substances and to harm to habitat, the compensation doesn't allow us to use it in the case of water quality degradation.
What sort of an approach would be used in that context?
The only approach is to try to regulate the deposit of deleterious substance to the lowest level possible. We do have a set of regulations that allow for standards to be established for major industries, but not for the smaller industries that deposit deleterious substances into fish-frequented waters.
Now this habitat policy, and just for the sake of the record, it's Exhibit 260 already in these proceedings. I don't think I need it brought up on screen. But the proper name is the Policy for the Management of Fish Habitat, but in shorthand I think people refer to it as the Habitat Policy or the 1986 Habitat Policy. Not every policy that we've been leading in evidence dates in the mid-80s, and I think that suggests that this is a policy that has stood the test of time over many years. I take it you were involved, Mr. LeBlanc, in preparing this original policy in the 80s?
That's correct. One of the members of the team that finalized the policy for ministers sitting to table in Parliament in 1986.
And there's been some discussion in recent years of a move towards a new or a revised, I'm not sure what the right word, if it's revised or a revision or a revamping, I don't know.
There's many words that have been used: modernize, renewal of the policy. Yes, there has been a number of discussions given the fact that it is a fairly old policy.
And I'll just identify that there's a question around, I'll preface my questions by saying this. We understand that some part of this revising or renewal of the policy may involve materials going to the minister and under consideration by the minister, and I'm not looking to go behind the curtains on what the minister is doing at this point, although it may be more related to the election than anything else. But let me ask you instead if you could offer us with the benefit of your involvement, your understanding and your sense of the timing, the progress, the work that has been done and is yet to be done towards a renewal of the policy.
significant amount of internal consultation has taken place over the last 4 or 5 years to identify some areas that could be improved in the policy. It's all been internal. Some policy research has been done. The minister has been briefed, however, there is no decision taken as yet to move outside to do some external, both internal and external consultation. The proposal, if it does go forward in terms of renewal of policy, would be to provide a discussion paper that would allow for discussion internally and externally with stakeholders and partners to get their feedback on potential improvements to the policy. And once that is achieved, that would take, we approximate about 6 months, and we would write a draft policy and also then go back to internal and external consultation on that draft policy and finalize it. The estimated time that we provided for the minister was about a year before we could go back to her with a final draft of the policy.
Has that occurred to this point?
No, none at all.
So is it the consultation you referred to as entirely internal at this point?
That is correct.
And the 1 year period, what does that, just so I'm clear about it, what is that, does that take us to the notional end release date of a new policy, or does that refer to this initial work?
That is correct. It would take 1 year to provide for the initial dialogue on the discussion paper, draft a new policy, and get ministerial approval and release of the policy within a year.
If I might move to number 30 on the exhibit list, please. You'll see your name there. I take it this is a presentation that you presented in Halifax in October of 2008. And if I could just confirm that I have that correct.
That's correct.
I'd ask this be marked as next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 648.
And I don't know that I need to go to particular parts, but I take it the context for this is that in 2008, already at that point, you're providing an update. I take it that's internal to DFO, but providing an update on the modernization of the habitat policy.
Yes, an update on where we were in terms of internal discussion.
And in fact, I said internal, but I know it's for the CCFAM. Could you describe for us what the CCFAM is and who may have been part of this, receiving this presentation, please?
The Canadian Council of Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers are all the ministers of provinces and territories, and our minister who chairs, or she chairs, sorry, that chairs the committee. Under that committee, there's an intergovernmental working group and a committee of deputy ministers. The Inland Fisheries Committee is one of the committees that reports to the deputy ministers committee, and it's provincial fisheries officials and DFO staff at the director level.
In terms of a renewal of the habitat policy, I'd appreciate your thinking and your own views as to where the new habitat policy should go, and in particular any comments on the principle of no net loss of productive capacity, whether that should be maintained or changed in some way.
Oh, I believe there are some very strong parts of that policy that should be retained, including the no net loss principle, guiding principle. It is at the heart of the policy. There will be some need to update some of the policies, especially the new legislation that have been introduced since the policy has been introduced in '86, such as the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, environmental assessment processes in the north, the duty to consult Aboriginal peoples, and the Species at Risk Act. The other is, I think, this is my view in terms of introducing the notion of an ecosystem-based approach and result-based regulation, a concept in terms of strengthening the policy itself. But the basic one would be applying an ecosystem-based approach to habitat management, where we would move away from individual, although not eliminate the project review, we would have provide a greater context in terms of assessing the impacts of human activities on fish and fish habitat by establishing standards, thresholds, identifying key priority habitats that need protection and conservation.
Ms. Reed, I'd like to ask you a similar, it's the type of question picking up on the last point. There's, as we've heard, a move to modernize or renew the habitat policy. Could you offer us your perspective on whether there is a need and what the need is to change the existing habitat policy, please?
Well, similar to Chris, I think that the principle of no net loss is one that's fundamental to the policy and something that should be continued. I do agree that there are aspects of the policy that are out of date and need to be updated, similar to what Chris has already said. So that would be my summary.
Thank you. Mr. Wong?
Similar to the others, I think the no net loss principle is essential, and there is certainly room to provide for some updating to the policy. And I think the important thing from on the ground kind of practitioners level is to ensure that that guidance is clear and enabling, and also to ensure that ultimately it's getting the results that are going to provide for sustainability for the resource long term.
As the habitat policy has been so central a document, as I take it, in the work of the HMP, the Habitat Management Program, for so many years, and Mr. Wong, I'll perhaps start with you this time and go the other direction. Are there particular things, having worked with the habitat policy and the formulation, the offsetting approach, the no net loss principle, do you have particular, if there were to be a revamped habitat policy, are there particular things that you want to see or are afraid of seeing in the new policy?
Well, on the room for change side, I think some of the strict interpretation of the way the hierarchy of preferences for offsetting or compensation are laid out are at times restrictive, and sometimes will compel a certain project to choose a compensation option that isn't necessarily as useful as other measures, but either proponents or our staff will feel compelled to sort of go to the first preference in the hierarchy first. So some adjusted guidance that provides for maybe choosing the most effective offset as opposed to always rigorously following a hierarchy would be useful, I think. On the side of things that operational staff may be concerned about, I think ultimately it would be what you would generalize as something that would lower the bar for habitat protection. It's a very challenging thing to implement, and a strong policy is very, very helpful in terms of trying to carry that forward operationally.
Are there things that you're afraid of seeing? Do you have?
Well, certainly, I think I spoke quite directly to the importance of having that no net loss principle carried forward, and I think something that would adjust that or make that less clear or certain would introduce potentially a challenge to making decisions that afford for long-term sustainability of the habitat base.
Ms. Reed, are there things in this work towards a revised or renewed policy, are there particular things you'd like to see there or particularly do not want to see there?
Well, one of the things that I think is important from an operational perspective, when I look at, in my job, working with habitat practitioners and trying to make decisions around mitigation or compensation measures, is this balance between conservation and economics. And the policy speaks to that and talks about the need for that balance. But it is in many ways left to the practitioner, to the program, to come up with the right balance, and it's often a challenge. In the case of environmental assessments, particularly the more complex ones, there are methods to sort of allow for that balance to be found. But in the case of the habitat policy itself, I think that it would be useful to have more direction on that question. The other aspect that is already incorporated into the policy, but I think is extremely important, is the aspect of partnerships, whether it be with local or provincial governments or with First Nations. I think that strengthening that part of the policy would be very helpful as well. And as far as things I wouldn't want to see lost, again, I would go back to the not wanting to see the loss of the no net loss principle.
Mr. LeBlanc, anything to add on this question of the work towards a new policy?
I think one of the consideration is that the habitat policy is a framework policy, and I think it needs a set of other principles which might line up with some of the things that Rebecca has mentioned, such as risk-based, best placed, who is best placed to help deliver on some of these functions that we have to carry out, whether it's provinces, territories, conservation groups, industry, or what have you, but also a principle of accountability, that who takes on some of this work is accountable to deliver on it, and there's some mechanisms to audit these. I would also say that one of the things is that while the policy has remained since 1986, we have developed a series of operational policies that hang from that policy, and maybe for a framework policy that you've got to be careful that you add too much in it and you align it with some more operational policies that provide the kind of guidance that Jason and Rebecca mentioned.
If I could just clarify, please, Mr. LeBlanc, in terms of understanding the current status of this work towards the new policy, could you just advise me if is it the case that this is at a point where the minister has to say yes or no? They're waiting for a ministerial direction or decision on whether this work continues?
The minister has been briefed on this, and her decision was to seek some input from her cabinet colleagues. That was to happen in a month or this month, and unfortunately a democratic event has occurred and has sort of delayed that.
All right, so stay tuned. We'll have to wait and see.
That's exactly right.
I'm going to next turn to a few questions on whether Canada is achieving no net loss. Why don't I simply start with that, Mr. LeBlanc? Is Canada achieving no net loss of the productive capacity of fish habitat?
I think my answer would be yes and no. I think yes, in some cases we do in individual projects, but overall when we assemble all of the projects that we assess and what have you, we may be losing more than we are protecting. So generally speaking, we may be losing habitat overall. In some cases, in some projects, we are able to attain a no net loss of productive capacity, but in other areas, I think we do lose some habitat. I'm not sure whether it's 10% or 50% or what have you. We have no real true measure of to assess whether we are achieving a no net loss of productive capacity, and we are hoping to get some better indicators to allow us to measure this principle.
What is the work involved in getting those indicators, and who does that, or who should be doing that?
Right at the moment, we have put on a priority for science, a national priorities for the Canadian Scientific Advisory Secretariat, CSAS is called. There's a peer review process, and they have been asked to develop indicators for fish habitat this fiscal year.
Mr. Wong, if you could please field the same question, and if you can tie it back to Fraser River sockeye habitat, that's helpful. Is Canada achieving no net loss?
Certainly from the operational level, all the indications are no, and it's a very complicated circumstance to operate in and respond to. I would say Fraser sockeye habitat, at least in the interior area that we work in, is probably better off than habitat for some other salmon species, just because of the nature of the biology and where those fish live. But there is a tremendous amount of change from a natural landscape going on because of human activity in that watershed. Some of that change DFO has a direct regulatory authority for, and that comes into us and we review it. On that stuff, I think we do okay, not perfectly, but we're okay. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't come to us for a variety of reasons. Either it's got an indirect effect to a fish habitat, you know, it's something very upland, perhaps, from a river or a lake, or stuff that a proponent may choose not to bring to us for a variety of reasons that also has, I guess, a cumulative incremental effect.
And to pick up on Mr. LeBlanc's point, what work do you think is needed to measure the habitat, the gain or loss of habitat?
Well, certainly some start at getting a benchmark or a baseline or a status of the habitat base at a place in time, so that you could then go back into the future and assess the same measures, and you would have something more specific and direct to give you a determination as to whether the circumstance is better or worse as far as habitat goes. So the habitat indicator type work that I think Patrice touched on, that has been I guess touched on or started through the wild salmon policy type work, is very useful, and if it was completed and we had that benchmark, it would be very helpful in managing now and into the future.
From your work in the interior area, can you give an example of a particular type of challenge to achieving no net loss, in particular for Fraser River sockeye habitat?
Well, a simple example would be something like development in the Shuswap area outside of Kamloops, which is subject to a range of pressures. There are things that I would call historic pressures from traditional land uses like agriculture and forestry. There are linear developments from railways and hydro right-of-ways and things like that, highways. And more recently, there's been a really significant increase in property development, recreational, residential, as well as recreational type activity out in that lake. So it's a very significant salmon producing lake, and there are a number of changes that are occurring day to day and year to year in that lake, most of which are not positive for fish and fish habitat.
Ms. Reid, I haven't asked you questions on this point. Do you have any comments or answers to provide?
Well, just with respect to habitat indicator work, I would say that in the Pacific region, we have done some of that work under the rubric of the wild salmon policy, the strategy 2, which is all around habitat monitoring. And that strategy 2 work, essentially, we spent a number of years coming up with indicators in order to measure health of a particular unit. And so that methodology has been developed, and some of the initial habitat status reports have been done, but at a preliminary level. And I think that completion of that work will be very helpful in moving forward in coming up with the status of habitat at a conservation unit level and at a more discrete level.
And when you talk about the terminology, the wild salmon policy, doing that work under strategy 2, that refers to Heather Stahlberg's work, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And to pick up on the point you just offered, is it the case that the habitat status reports that have been done as pilot projects, and it's not that's not ongoing work at this stage?
Well, I would characterize it as, so the methodology has been developed, and we are beginning to do those status indicator, the status reports. They're not pilots, they're simply picking watersheds to start with, and then the intent is to carry on.
And who is and who should be responsible for the science advice on that sort of strategy 2 monitoring work?
Well, so the work that Heather did was in concert with the science branch, and so I would see a cooperative relationship on that work.
Could I just add a point of clarification, I think, in terms of no net loss? One of the key items in the no net loss, and in terms of an authorization that is issued by the department under the authority of the Fisheries Act, is a condition that we can place under the authorization, although it's not enforceable. There is a follow-up monitoring. What we need, I think, is, and we are working on that this fiscal year, is rigorous methodologies for doing 2 things. One is to verify the actual that's occurred harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of habitat. And the other one is the effectiveness of the compensation measure. That is important to have that, so there's a standardized methodology used across the country, a scientifically rigorous methodology. And the other part of that is for having the results of these monitoring programs undergo a strict peer review process, whether it's through the Canadian Scientific Advisory secretariat or other mechanism. There is a peer review, scientifically peer reviewed, and then we can learn from that and use that results of those evaluations to feedback and change the compensation measures that we use or methodology that we may have adopted for a certain project.
And I wonder if I might try and approach some further questions on this question of habitat compensation by turning to the Quigley and Harper work in particular. I'll do that first with number 8, please, Mr. Bissett on the list. And you'll see this come up on the screen. It dates to March of 2006. It is out to distribution, as you it's addressed to. I take it that suggests that it's going out at a fairly broad level, and indicating that the recently published results of the National Evaluation Program to assess the performance of compensation projects in achieving no net loss of fish habitat productivity are being circulated out to people. I take it in the habitat group,
Yes.
nationally.
Yes.
If I could ask this be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 649.
And in fact, what I will, for the benefit of participants, the Quigley-Harper papers were included in our exhibit lists. I won't turn to them now, but for the reference of people here, it's numbers 9 through 14 on our list of exhibits. Given the limited time I have, I don't propose to go to the source materials, and instead I'll take a shortcut, if I might, by referring to the Policy and Practice Report, or PPR. And in particular, I think it'll be numbered page 26 for you, Mr. Bissett, and page 22 and paragraph 52 on the printed page. Just under paragraph 52, there's a graph that sets out a summary that we've prepared of the Quigley-Harper work. And to review that quickly, and I'll just take a moment to do this, the literature review that's cited there refers to the authors having located and reviewed 10 studies from the literature that was existent. The results listed at the bottom of the second column, over half of the projects were determined to have had smaller compensation areas than had areas, and over 1/3 clearly did not achieve no net loss. The next piece to this work was a file review. You'll see it described there. It analyzed files for 124 had authorizations, 105 of which were from this province in the range of 1994 to 1997. Results: 25% had smaller compensation areas than has. Determination of no net loss could only be made for 14% of authorizations due to poor compliance with monitoring requirements, and because the performance criteria used by DFO does not assess effectiveness / no net loss. The compliance audit listed next involved site visits to 52 of the 124 authorizations that were randomly selected. And on the next page under results, you'll see that 86% of authorizations had larger had or smaller compensation than authorized, or both. 2/3 resulted in net loss of habitat area. And the fourth point, the effectiveness study evaluating 16 of the 52, 7 of those being in this province. The results described there: 63% of authorizations resulted in net losses of habitat productivity. So that's a cumbersome question, I suppose, but I do that to have in our minds the Quigley and Harper work in the mid-2000s. If you could please, and Mr. LeBlanc, when I start with you and then ask the other panelists, if you could comment please on the importance of the work done by Mr. Quigley and Harper in particular, and the influence of that work, and also what has been done since that time.
I believe that this was an important piece of work that sort of revealed several sort of weaknesses with the application of the no net loss principle, compensation, and as well compliance regime that is really important in terms of making sure people are following the compensation measures and authorization. Very little has been done since in terms of doing another evaluation of this kind to see whether we have improved, although we have provided further guidance to staff as well as others in terms of ensuring that there is compliance, and we have now a monitoring unit, compliance monitoring group in each of the regions that is to provide some audit and monitoring of conformity with the requirements of authorization. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to confirm whether these compliance numbers are the same. As well, I think if we can refine the methodologies I mentioned before to test and validate the accuracy of the predicted impacts as well as the effectiveness of the compensation, that will help us. But these take time, and as you can see, this was back in 2006, and it's a little over 6 years since this report, and we recognize that we do need to do some more work to improve the performance of our compensation measures.
Mr. Wong, from your perspective, how important was the Clearly Harper work, and what's happened since?
Well, the work was important on many levels. I think it certainly sent some clear messaging to managers and staff as in terms of how we were doing. And I think it was important for managers, I count myself there because at the time I was a manager, it was important for managers to understand that we had to provide some clearer direction to our staff, and that we had a results gap here. And it was also important to staff because my impression was, by and large, staff felt that writing the authorizations as they were was effective, and then they would move on to the next thing. And it's understandable because there's a significant workload train. You get one done and there's another thing waiting, and you don't always make time to get out and see how the project performed based on your guidance. So there was a strong message for staff that we probably, at the operational level, needed to change some of our habits and practices. I think one of the things that it demonstrates, really, though, is that no net loss is quite difficult to achieve, even on a fairly carefully overseen project. And notwithstanding the fact that this audit shows that there were gaps and that no net loss wasn't achieved, I think it also demonstrates that there were positive things gained for the habitat of the fish by DFO's engagement. And while we may not have gotten to 100%, my feeling is that the habitat and the fisheries resource was still better off by way of DFO's engagement.
Ms. Reid, any comments to add on this?
Just to add that subsequent to this work, at an operational level, the Habitat Program managers worked hard to engage staff to make this type of work and others meaningful. For example, in large area meetings, we would have situations or case studies. So a habitat practitioner would come up and present a project and talk about the mitigation, the compensation in a time series. And so those types of presentations were made, which I think were also sort of useful for making this type of work and to inspire staff, in working further on those types of projects. So that type of stuff was ongoing as well.
I'd like to ask some questions that we'll use as a starting point of some past reports, and in particular the CESD, the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development reports, which I know you're familiar with. I'll just narrate for a moment to say that some of these, there's been a series of significant reports that speak to this topic. Mr. Commissioner, they're summarized in Exhibit 14. They've been discussed in your interim report. Some of those reports are also listed for the benefit of participants in our exhibit list as numbers 26 through 29. Again, I'll try to use the shortcut of the PPR rather than going to those documents, and I'll focus the questions on some of the points made in the CESD reports, in particular the 2009 CESD report. If we could please turn to page 23 of the printed page, page 27 on the screen, I expect, or in Adobe, paragraph 54 of this PPR. Paragraph 54 indicates that in response to the 2009 report of the CESD, the Department agreed to, by March 2, 2010, determine what actions are required to fully implement the habitat policy. And then a description that's set out there that in March 2011, DFO will table a report to the CESD outlining the Department's progress made on this and other commitments arising from the 2009 report. Now I'll go back to some of the points made in relation to the 2009 report. Mr. LeBlanc, could you comment on the status of these things, please, that are set out there?
Yes, the update on the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development report on protecting fish habitat has been submitted to the Deputy Minister for her approval and for submission to the Commissioner. I'm not sure whether it has been signed yet, but from a week or so ago, it had not left the department.
There's two documents that may assist us as we move through this. So one, if Mr. Bissett, if you could please keep this document handy to PPR. The other one is number 32 on our list, which is a management action plan. And I understand there may be a more recent version, but I'll work from this one as much as I can. This bears declassification date, I take it, is Valentine's Day of this year. But it may be that the document itself dates to an earlier point of time. Mr. LeBlanc, maybe you could just give us some quick understanding of what this document is. It's a map or management action plan, I take it?
Yes, the responses to the recommendations were put into what's called a management action plan that would identify the actions taken and measure progress against these. And it identifies the various responsibility centers in the department that are accountable for meeting the act or for implementing the actions. In this case, Environment Canada has some recommendations. Science, our science sector, conservation protection, and the Habitat Management Program Group and the Habitat Policy Group. So each sector has a responsibility to respond to each of these. This was done to give an update to our new incoming Assistant Deputy Minister. There is a more up-to-date version available that, as I recall or mentioned before, was provided to the Deputy Minister to provide to the CSD.
If I could ask this to be marked as the next exhibit, please.
It was 650.
And I'll try and approach it using this document, but certainly if there's different information or new information that you can provide, we appreciate that. I think we have available the newer version too, but if you can tell us, Mr. LeBlanc, we should be moving to look at that. The question I have first is on page 2 of this. If we look at paragraph 1.80, and I'll read it out. The recommendation which comes from the 2009 CESD report summarized here: Fisheries and Oceans Canada should determine what actions are required to fully implement the 1986 Habitat Policy and confirm whether it intends to implement all aspects of the policy. The response in the next column: the department accepts this recommendation. By March 2010 will determine what actions are required to fully implement the policy. And then the action taken in the third column refers to the DFO having completed its review of the 1986 Fish Habitat Management Policy, and then a conclusion, and will be renewing the policy. Is anything changed in terms of the response that's set out there? Is that the department's view of the response to that recommendation from the CESD?
That is consistent.
I want to try and ask you this question just to help me understand, because I wonder if there's a sense in which saying that the policy will be renewed is a way of not answering the question of whether the habitat policy itself is being implemented or whether it should be implemented. In other words, a cynic might look at that and say, well, that's not an answer as to whether this policy is going to be implemented and what steps should be done to implement it, but rather sort of saying, well, hang on a second, we're going to move to a brand new policy. I'm not saying that's my view of it, but I'd like to have your response to that perspective.
Well, in the review of the habitat policy, what we've looked at is the implementation of the 8 strategies, and in many cases, we do implement many of these. The focus being on strategy number 1, protection and compliance. Mind you, most of our resources are dedicated to that, but many of the things have now been sort of rolled up in other things. So for example, cooperative action and outreach and public education and information and consultation has been rolled up into partnering most of the partnering effort that we do in engaging others from industry, NGOs, and provinces and territories and municipalities are done under that umbrella. We do provide some support for habitat improvement, but very low in across Canada. Science is supporting our program, so that's scientific and monitoring. We started enhancing that capacity. So in many cases, we do implement all of these strategies. We haven't estimated, and we were told by our deputy minister, and the deputy minister at the time mentioned to the commission, this is not something that you can recommend that we increase our resources in. It should be neutral in terms of that. Just recommend where we are not doing what we're supposed to do. So the level of effort that we spend on each of these has not been estimated, and any estimate of whether we need additional resources has not been done.
And appreciating what you've just said, that there hasn't been a precise analysis of, if you will, the costing or the nature of the resourcing that you need. Could you give us, though, your sense? Is this far out of reach? Is this unattainable, absent a massive shift in funding?
Well, I do believe that we can maybe rebalance some of the things in the policy that we should be doing, some more monitoring by trying to streamline the regulatory review process while maintaining the effectiveness in terms of protecting and conserving the resource. But I believe that we've been using our resources to the best that we can that are allocated in order to focus on, first and foremost, our regulatory responsibilities, which is embedded in the first strategy of the policy. But like everybody else, everybody could use additional resources. That is something that would help us to implement some of the other aspects. But the level of those resources, nobody's done any estimates.
Mr. Wall, from your point of view operationally, have you ever seen an assessment of what would be required to fully implement the habitat policy?
No, not anything that's come across my desk nationally. We've undertaken a few exercises, I would call them kind of tabletop type exercises with some experienced staff or managers to sort of estimate that out. And we've created a few relatively ad hoc type charts or summaries and things like that to make an effort in that regard. But there's been nothing formal done.
And what's been and I appreciate that's an informal process, and I take it as people around the table doing their best to get a sense of the magnitude of the work involved. Could you give us, though, what conclusions you reached?
Well, the details are a bit fuzzy because it was a while ago now, but I could say that at the time we thought we needed more resources, but not infinitely more. It was if I remember correctly, in the interior, we were looking at something around 30 to 35 was a number based on this again, desktop type exercise that we've done of habitat staff. But that was also with the understanding that the way we currently operate in the department in this region, we also have the salmon enhancement program that operates out under the same umbrella in our region, but as a separate sub-program. That looks after some things that are tied very directly to the habitat policy. An example of that being we have a habitat restoration unit, both within our area and all the other areas in our region that do focus on that kind of work, which is a habitat policy strategy, but that is not resourced from within the habitat program nationally.
Ms. Reid?
Well, I think on the question of whether we've implemented the policy, if you look at the 8 strategies, at least in the Pacific region, I can certainly make the argument that over time we have implemented each of those 8 strategies in varying degrees. As funding becomes available, we've focused on different parts. And so previously when we had what we call B-based money, there was a big emphasis focused on stewardship type activities, which is consistent with one of the strategies. You could argue that some of the science research work, indicator work, is part of what the wild salmon policy has done. As Jason's already spoken about the salmon enhancement program, that's obviously a big focus on not just community programs, but restoration activities as well. And so if you like, we could go through each of those strategies and talk about how they've been implemented in varying degrees. I think what isn't happening right now is we don't have an even approach to how the policies is being implemented. And so in the Habitat program, you've got a major focus on the more regulatory aspects of it, of the conservation and protection. In SEP, you've got to focus on the enhancement, on the stewardship pieces. And there's bits and pieces, and in order to make an estimate of what's required in order to fully implement the policy, I think it would be tough, because first you'd need to say, well, how much do we want to implement each of those elements? And it's in some degrees it could be infinite. So you need to kind of make an assessment of, so for each of those 8 elements, how far do we want to go, and then how much of a effort do we want to put into each, and then kind of do that evaluation. And so the numbers could be quite variable depending on where you want to put your focus and emphasis.
Mr. Wisher, I know the time, and I wonder if I might canvass whether we might have a 10-minute break. I'm trying to see if I can finish my questions before the midday break at 12:30. If that's agreeable. Thank you.
Bring it on recess for 10 minutes.